jump right in. So in my talk, I will introduce the topic of reading culture. Reading culture is a very broad term for the various ways in which people received and read texts. And it's a concept that is harder to grasp or visualize than, for instance, economic culture or art history. So for my talk, I will use an anchor. I will focus on the De Consolatione Philosophiae, or the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. I have chosen to work with this text for several reasons. First, it's a text from the beginning of the Middle Ages that remained popular throughout the entire period of the Middle Ages, and even beyond that time, right up until our time. There are hundreds of copies dating from the Middle Ages, according to one source, even more than 900. On the slide, you can see some samples from that are connected to Bruges. And secondly, I chose this text because it has been translated in many European vernaculars in the Middle Ages and in our time, which adds another interesting layer of audiences. And thirdly, because it's important not only for its place in philosophy, theology, and literature, but also because of its impact on art history. The iconographic program of medieval consolation manuscripts has had an important impact on the imagery of concepts like the Wheel of Fortune, which you can see on the screen. Because of its various layers, there is a good chance that you will encounter or have already encountered a copy of this text in your lifetime, which makes it ideal, I think, for today's session. The Consolation was, not surprisingly, also present in, maybe someone else can let people in the meeting. Wim, perhaps you can do that. Thank you. So the Consolation was also present in the libraries of the monk abbeys, and the monk abbeys are the Benedictine abbeys of St. Bavo and St. Peter, and Cistercian abbeys of Tendeunen and Terdust. For my research on their medieval libraries, I have studied medieval book lists and surviving copies. And this showed that St. Bavo, Tendeunen, and Terdust owned copies of the Consolation, and that more in general, the text was widely present in medieval Bruges and Ghent. I haven't found specific evidence for St. Peter's Abbey, but given the highly intellectual profile of this abbey, I think it's fair to presume that St. Peter's also owned copies of the Consolation. Of the monastic copies I have inventoried, 4 have survived. And today I will present these 4 copies to you so we can see how this text was produced, used, and perceived in the monk abbeys over the span of 4 centuries. The observations in this sample will allow us to draw some conclusions about medieval reading culture. The first copy comes from the Abbey of Terdust and was made in the 12th century. The second copy dates from the first quarter of the 13th century and comes from the library of Tendeunen Abbey. Then we jump to the 15th century with a copy made for Tendeunen Abbot Jan Krabbe and a copy made for St. Bavo Abbot Raphael de Mercatellis. A quick word perhaps about the layout of my slide. I actually wanted to show you these manuscripts in the Mirador IIIF viewer, where you can easily compare manuscripts from different institutions. You can pull them up and compare them easily in a very uniform environment. But it turned out to be very impractical in Teams to constantly switch between a slideshow and a web page. But this screenshot gives you an idea of the possibilities of Mirador, and you can find more information on our website or during the Mmmonk School session on 16 December. I will give you a summary of the Consolation, but to truly understand this work, we first need to take a look at the context in which it was created. Boethius was born in Rome around 480, so at the end of antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages. He translated works by classical authors like Aristotle from Greek to Latin because knowledge of Greek was fading among his contemporaries and he wanted to preserve Greek wisdom. He was also a writer. He wrote, among others, on musical theory and Christian doctrine. As a consequence, Boethius is often considered an important transitional figure between antiquity and the Christian Middle Ages. He was also a politician. He was consul in Rome and held the highest position at the court of the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, who reigned over the Western Roman Empire. But in 523, fortune turns against him. Boethius becomes implicated in a conspiracy against Theodoric. A court of senators condemns him for high treason and occult practices, whatever that means, and he is imprisoned in Pavia. In his cell, he writes the Consolation while he awaits either his execution or perhaps a pardon. His text is philosophical and apologetic also, and it can be read as a manual on how to cope with misfortune and injustice. The protagonist of the Consolation is Boethius, and the setting of the book is his cell. But in what follows, I will call the protagonist the prisoner to avoid confusion with Boethius, the author. The Consolation consists of 5 books, and on the screen you can see the beginning of Book 1 in our 4 monk copies. In Book 1, we find the prisoner filled with self-pity. The book opens with a melodramatic lament in verse, in which the prisoner cries over his fall from grace. But then Lady Philosophy appears in his cell. Now I will pull up this lovely miniature from the Mercatellis manuscript so you can get a good look. Lady Philosophy sends away the muses of poetry. Those are the 3 ladies standing next to Boethius's bed. And they were there to help the prisoner or articulate his grief. Philosophy calls them harlots of the stages, and she shoos them away. She then diagnoses the prisoner as if she were a physician and he were her patient. She calls him dull-witted, so stupid, basically, because he abandoned the spirit of philosophical inquiry and instead descended into self-absorbed misery. His mind is befogged, she says, imprisoned in chains, when he listens to emotions instead of reason. This is the beginning of Book 2 in our copies. In Book 2, Lady Philosophy gives the prisoner a soft treatment or medicine by showing him first what causes his illness. She says he is ill because he desires to regain what he has lost and because he resents what has happened to him. She then argues that he has no reason to complain because the successes and wealth he enjoyed were never his, but were a gift from Lady Fortune. And you can see Lady Fortune and her Wheel of Fortune in the top half of the miniature. Lady Fortune has the right to take her gifts away whenever she wants. So to accept the successes means accepting the losses. Or, better yet, by not caring about the mundane, you can step off the Wheel of Fortune and it will lose its power over you. In Book 3, Lady Philosophy explains that the worldly ways to happiness cannot lead to true happiness. She says, riches, power, glory or fame, and bodily pleasures are worthless because they can be taken away and can cause pain and sorrow. They actually distract us from the truth and from happiness. But fear not, says Philosophy, man does not forget his true nature, even though he is chained by earthly distractions. The Consolation is written in a prosimetric form. Each chapter consists of a prose part followed by a poem. I will read a fragment from a poem in chapter 2 of book 3 about wild animals who don't forget their nature to give you a sense of the language and style adopted by Boethius. I will read it in a beautiful translation by P.G. Walsh, but you can read the Latin text and a Dutch translation on the screen. Though Punic lions proudly wear their handsome chains, accepting food which human hands for them prepare, as cowed by their harsh lord, they brood, inured to bear his savage blows. Yet pride, long dormant, then revives, should blood besmear their bristly jaws. Deep roars awake their earlier lives. Constraining bonds they fiercely burst, no halters now their necks engage. With blood-stained teeth, they mangle first their tamer, roused to furious rage. And this is what that poem looks like in the 4 manuscript. So she says, as soon as a tamed lion tastes blood, his true wild nature comes back to him. And as soon as we embrace philosophy, we will remember our true nature. Happiness comes when we reject the transitory world and turn towards introspection. Then, through recollection of self, we will remember how the world is ordered by God and how we will find true happiness by reuniting with the divine. In the middle of book 3, the format of the text changes. So far, philosophy spoke and the prisoner listened. But now it becomes a Socratic dialogue in which the prisoner asks questions and offers counter-arguments. In book 4, the prisoner asks a very important question. How can evil exist in a world that is ordered and ruled by a supreme divine being? How can he, a good man, be unjustly sentenced to death by corrupt and evil senators? The answer is twofold. First, the evil man might be in control, but only doing good can give real power. Evildoers are dehumanizing themselves and are putting more distance between themselves and the divine, and we should actually pity them, even if they are powerful in this world. And secondly, injustice exists because some people need evil to eventually attain the good. This is ordered by fate, which is a realization of providence, and providence is the divine reason which directs the course of the world. Book 5 is the most philosophical or logical book. It discusses how providence and free will can be reconciled. The prisoner is asking about predetermination. He wants to know if free will exists, if God already knows everything that will happen. Here, philosophy dives into Platonist categories of knowing. The conclusion is, simply put, it's too complicated for our empirical minds to understand, but foreknowledge or providence is not the same as predetermination, so there is free will. She consoles the prisoner with some practical advice. The more an individual soul is locked into earthly things, and especially into vices, the less is its capacity to deploy reason in making free choices. So the overall conclusion of the book is: detach yourself from earthly matters, remember the divine order through recollection of self, and you will find true happiness. I have read the Consolation in English, in the Oxford World's Classics edition by Walsh, and in Dutch, in a translation by Piet Gerbrandy, both beautiful translations. And I just want to say, if I can read this, so can you. I'm not a philosopher, and I really didn't need to be to enjoy this. Any good edition will have an apparatus with explanations, so should you wish to dive into the deeper meaning and sources. But the Consolation is also a really enjoyable literary work, which, as you might have noticed from the summary, contains quite a bit of humor and some sound moral advice. So in this session on reading culture, I would like to advocate for some reading pleasure, some reading fun, and to let you know that if you haven't already, you might enjoy reading a medieval text just for fun. So why not give the Consolation a try? If you have already read the Consolation, I would highly recommend reading a text by Cicero next, the De Officiis, or On Duties, in a Dutch translation here. It's also a moral or ethical treatise, but it's more practical in nature, it's less religious, and it discusses the best ways to live as a responsible individual in society. Cicero wrote this as a manual for his son shortly before he was assassinated in 44 before Christ. So this is a very good book, and definitely I recommend this to all of you. Then a third recommendation, is a book I read this summer, and it blew me away. It's the Cité des Dames, or Book of the City of Ladies by Christine de Pizan. It's very famous, of course, and this was the first medieval book I've read with a very strong female point of view, which was very refreshing. It's in many ways very modern, but it also gives us an insight into the lives of women in France in the 14th century. And I think that's why we read books, at least I do, to be transported into someone else's mind. I think via medieval texts, we learn about their opinions, but also about everyday issues like how they interacted with their parents, how they were educated, what kind of clothes did they wear. Um, so I think it generates a kind of first-hand understanding and empathy that is harder to find, perhaps, in other medieval resources. So the Cité des Dames, definitely recommended. And finally, I know that there would be art historians today in the audience, so I thought about a good recommendation for them. And if they don't know it already, I would recommend The Golden Legend, or The Legenda Aurea by Jacobus de Voragine. It's a compilation of descriptions of the lives and martyrdoms of Christian saints, and it is a work that has hugely influenced the imagery of painting and stained glass and other types of artwork. I must tell you, it's not for the faint-hearted. It has a lot of detailed descriptions of horrific tortures, so you might not want to read this from cover to cover. But all in all, it's an excellent resource for medieval religious culture. And before we jump back to the Consolation, I would like to invite you to share some reading recommendations in the chat. So I'm always looking for new ideas, and if you have enjoyed medieval text lately and this is available in modern editions, available for wide audiences, then I would love to read your recommendations in the chat. Back to the Consolation. So from my quick summary of the Consolation, you have already seen that our 4 monastic copies all look different. Although all 4 manuscripts were made for and used by monks, they were designed differently and they were used differently, according to the needs of specific readers and according to fashions of the time. I will now go through the manuscripts with you, looking for clues about readership, meaning who the readers were, and about the reception of the text, meaning how the readers used the Consolation. If you want to find out more about the intended readership of a medieval copy, it's always very useful to take a step back and to look at the entire volume. On the screen, you can see the 4 books. Now take a look at the sizes. Can you see my pointer? I hope you can see my pointer. Well, number 2 and number 3 are about this size. So that's a very practical, small, easy to handle volume. When a medieval book is this size, this small, it's often an indication that this book was intended for private individual use. Number 4 is this size. It's huge. I didn't have a book this size in my library, so I took one from my children. It's exactly the same size as Mercatellis's book, as book number 4. So this is really huge. And the fact that this is that I had to take this from my children's library is meaningful, because this is a book that is intended for use in a group. So by me, when I read for them, so at least 2 people, maybe more. And when medieval books are this size, that's also usually a sign that it's made for use by a group, by several people at the same time. For instance, a group of monks singing from a manuscript, or to be used by a lector to read out loud for a group with the book held on a standard, like in church or at court. A large size can also signal that it was a volume intended to display status and prestige. So size can tell us something about use. The next step is to see if our volumes contain any texts other than the Consolation. And in the oldest manuscript, so manuscript number 1, the Consolation is copied with an anonymous apparatus of glosses or commentaries that run along the text of the Consolation. If you can see my pointer, I'm pointing at the column in a larger script. That's the text by Boethius. Also at the top of the page, this is the Consolation, so the text by Boethius. And then in a smaller script, we have the anonymous commentary that runs along the Consolation. So all of this contains an explanation of the text that is juxtaposed. And then in the same volume, we also have a standalone commentary on the Consolation by William of Conches. So the reader, or the readers for whom this copy was made, did not just need a copy of the Consolation. They wanted commentaries and a separate treatise to make sense of the Consolation for them from a Christian point of view. The treatise was written in the beginning of the 12th century by William of Conches, so close to the date of production of our manuscript, which tells us that the reader wanted or needed to remain up to date. This type of commentaries on authoritative texts are a very common concept in Christianity throughout the entire Middle Ages, and especially with the rise of scholasticism. Commentators used to expound scripture, church fathers, pagan authors from antiquity, etc. The Consolation is a bit unique in a sense because Boethius was a Christian. He wrote about Christian concepts like the Trinity, but in the Consolation, he actually rarely refers to Christian concepts or scripture. The closest we come to a Christian God is a prayer to a Platonist demiurge in the middle of Book 3. So there is certainly much work to be done here for Christian commentators. Alcuin of York is said to have been the first person to write a Christian commentary for the Consolation. From the 9th until the 15th century, there are no less than 26 commentaries. The commentators are especially interested in what Boethius has to say about the role of fate, providence, free will, and the origin of the soul. And the Consolation is extremely popular with the Neo-Platonists, but also remains popular when Aristotle becomes the center of attention in the 13th century. When we look at the other copies, we can see that none of them only have the Consolation. The text is always bound with other material. The large Mercatellis volume, number 4, also has a commentary that runs along the text of the Consolation. So in larger scripts, we have the Consolation, and then this small script which dominates the page is the commentary. His copy, so Mercatellis' copy, also has a text, a very famous text by Martianus Capella, which we also find in manuscript number 2. So Martianus Capella. Manuscript number 2 is quite special. It has 11 texts crammed onto a mere 80 folios. They are the Christian works by Boethius, called the Opuscula Sacra, and texts by Cicero. So manuscript 2 contains a wealth of ethical and moral resources. And manuscript number 3 has the highest number of folios. It has 209 folios, but it has the lowest number of texts. It contains our Consolation and Cicero's De Officiis, so 2 moral texts on how to conduct oneself in life and in the face of death. From this quick overview, it becomes clear that our text circulates in the company of Christian commentaries and in the company of classical authors. So this helps us to define in what genre or field medieval readers situated the Consolation, or from what angle they approached the Consolation. And now it is time to dive into the text. And to find our way, we need to look at navigational aids. These are elements on the page that help you find your way in the book and on the page. They are part of the production stage of the manuscript, which is not our focus today, but navigational aids can be useful to determine what the intended use of a book was, so I will include them today. Let's start in the 12th century. This is the hardest manuscript to navigate through. To begin with, there are no folio numbers and there is no table of contents. We do have a general title, On the image on the left, in the top left corner, you can see a general title. The layout also helps us. So again, here, the larger script is the consolation and the smaller script is the commentary. Then at the beginning of each of the 5 books, we have a large decorated initial. This also helps when you want to browse through the text. And then we have smaller initials at the beginning of new sentences or new paragraphs in the commentary. But that's it. So that's not a lot. For this talk, I've had to find specific sections, like the poem about the lion, but without book numbers or chapter numbers, it's very difficult to navigate through this text. This is clearly a volume intended for continuous reading from front to back, not for searching. It's for slow reading, for ruminating, for spiritual instruction, which corresponds to the typical monastic use. At Benedictine and Cistercian abbeys, there were moments of the day reserved for private spiritual reading, and this book would have been ideal for that. In the second manuscript, there is already a very useful upgrade. This volume has rubric titles at the beginning of each new book, and these rubric titles, they mention the number of the book. So it becomes a bit easier to flip through the various books. It has decorated initials at the beginning of new chapters, and the layout makes it clear where the verse parts are. So these are the poems at the end of the chapters. They are written in 2 columns and they are divided by these red lines, and they continue here. So because of the layout, we can distinguish the verse from the prose sections. But you can see that there is much more going on here in the margins. What happened here is that a 14th century reader marked off portions of the text to make it more useful for study. Now we are quickly crossing over from the realm of production to the realm of reception or use. The reader added running titles. So these make it easier to navigate on a volume level. You know, in this book there were 11 texts, so these running titles help us to determine that we are in the right text by Boethius. It says de consolatione, and it has the number of the book. The reader also broke up the continuous text by means of paragraph marks in the body of the text. So you can see he added them here on top of what was already there. In the margins, the reader added chapter numbers. So I highlighted those in yellow. At the top, we have a 2, a Gothic 2, and an M on top of it. So that's secundum, tertium, quartum. This here is the Gothic way to write 4. So this is 4, this is 5, and then we have 6. And then he marked off paragraph sections by means of these letters. So B, C, D, E. He also added short headings for each paragraph. They are a bit hidden, obscured by the highlight, but it says Visioe fiat philosophiam, so a vision of philosophy appears. And so these are very useful headings to find your way. All of these interventions combined show a very clear effort to structure the text for easy navigation for scholarly use by a person who wanted to be able to easily jump to specific parts of the text and to use it as a resource for ideas or quotes. Many of these navigational aids, like the running titles, start to appear in the 13th century, when people start to structure the Bible to make it more practical in use for study at universities. For manuscript number 3, we actually know who the intended reader was. This manuscript was made for Jan Krabbe, abbot of Ten Duinen Abbey from 1457 until 1488. Krabbe was an educated man with a great love for books and art. He commissioned some of the most beautiful books in the Burgundian Netherlands, and you can see 2 examples on the screen. And he was very proud of his books, as you can tell by the coat of arms in the 2 examples. In later life, he developed an interest in classical authors like Cicero, Caesar, Sallust, Virgil, and in humanist authors like Petrarca, Boccaccio, and Guarino da Verona. Krabbe's copy of the Consolation was made in Bruges at an Italian workshop. The script is a humanist litera textualis, and the choice of text is also inspired by humanism. But the decoration is typical for book production in Bruges. How is the text structured for navigation? Well, first a reminder, in this copy there are no glosses or commentaries, so navigation is already easier. The beginning of each new book is marked by decoration in the margins with flowers and strawberries, very lovely. It is also marked by a large decorated initial, and in this case, the beginning of book 1, it also has the initials, so I and C, Jan Krabbe. And it has a rubric title, so rubric title at the beginning of each new book, and it also mentions the number of the book, so that's very useful. On top of that, it has decorated initials at chapter beginnings, and it has enlarged initials protruding from the column at paragraph beginnings and at the beginning of each verse line. So all of these are verse lines, and you know the layout also helps us to distinguish verse from prose. In a cursive humanist script, a later hand added headings in the margins. For instance, it's probably too small for you to read, I'm afraid. But it says Conquestio Boethius super commutazione, so a lament of Boethius on the change. It just simply reiterates what it says in the paragraph. So we see that there was an effort by a later hand to add a bit more structure to the text, but not at all to the same degree as a previous manuscript. Now, what's interesting in Krabbe's copy, I already mentioned it, is that there are no commentaries or glosses to accompany the Consolation. And this is a break with medieval tradition, which again underlines Krabbe's penchant for humanism. In humanism, the interest for the Consolation changes. It's less from a religious or philosophical point of view, but they use it more as a source for grammatical and stylistic study in grammar schools. So in the copy of Jan Krabbe, we can see how the reception of the Consolation evolves over time. The fourth copy, dating from around 1483, is yet again something completely different, and it's also very telling of contemporary styles and tastes for reading. This copy is made for Raphael de Mercatellis. He was the abbot of St. Bavus Abbey, and he was an illegitimate son of Duke Philip the Good and an Italian woman living in Bruges. Now, Mercatellis, like Jan Krabbe, was not a modest, recluse monk. He was well connected politically, and he spent huge sums of money on a lavish lifestyle. And most importantly for us, he was obsessed by collecting books. His father, Philip the Good, is the most notorious book collector in the Burgundian Netherlands, so the apple did not fall far from the tree. The Mercatellis collection is unique because all of the approximately 70 surviving manuscripts were made to order for the abbot, so he commissioned all of them. They were all produced to the same standards in specialized workshops in Bruges and in Ghent. Mercatellis' copy opens with a table of contents. So yeah, that's already very useful and a novel feature. Now the headings in the table refer to the number of the book and to prose or poem. So I underlined it here in yellow. It says libro quarto and metro septimo. And that's still the way to refer to sections in the Consolation today. The table is something between a table of contents and an index because the headings are listed in alphabetical order, but the headings are quite lengthy instead of precise concepts or names. So I doubt it was very useful for specific searches. This book also has medieval folio numbers. It also has full-page miniatures at the beginning of each book, which makes it very easy to navigate. As you can see in this gallery, you can immediately see where a new book begins. On top of that, it also has all the navigational features that are present in the 3 other manuscripts. It actually has almost all of the navigational features or aids that we are used to having today. Another clue about readership and reception of a text are, of course, interventions or marks left by readers. And the first type of evidence are scribal interventions, because scribes are also readers, because they read the text in the exemplar, i.e. the book they will copy from, and they record their judgment on the text into the copy they make. When they are transcribing the text, they almost always alter it in some way, often by mistake, but sometimes also by design. And when they change the text by design, they do it as a response to peculiarities or difficulties they encounter in the text, and they do it because they think it would benefit the future reader of the copy. For instance, scribes could change the spelling of a word to correspond to more common local spelling. They would add explanations to difficult sections, and they even omitted parts, so they deleted parts of the text that they considered problematic in any way. They thought it was promiscuous or lewd or controversial. And they also could add translations for words in a foreign language. All of these changes show us how a text was received at that time in that area by that scribe. And as such, scribes are also readers and an important part of reception history and reading culture. This aspect of textual variation belongs to the realm of textual criticism, which is a wonderful discipline. But for this talk, I have isolated one tiny example, because if I would compare all of the manuscripts for textual variation, that could take me a lifetime. So I've isolated one tiny example by looking at how the scribes have handled Greek in the Consolation. For instance, Boethius quotes from Juvenal's satires in Book 3, Prose 6. In the first manuscript from the 12th century, the quotes are rendered in Greek, in red writing, but they have interlinear translations in Latin, in black or brown writing. So apparently it was not deemed evident that the monks would be able to understand this quote in Greek. In the 12th century, at the start of the Cistercian order, monks weren't necessarily highly educated. Higher education at universities for Cistercian monks is organized from the 13th century onwards. And then below, we have our second manuscript. This was the grubby, filled to the brim manuscript structured by a reader in the 14th century. And we can see that the quote is given in Greek without a translation. So again, this copy was made for an educated person, and not only for an educated person, quite possibly also by an educated person. The execution of the script and decoration suggests to me that this copy was made not by a professional scribe, but by the actual owner. Then Jan Krabbe's copy, the humanist copy, only has the Latin quote. And the same is true for the copy made for Raphael de Mercatellis. So having the Greek original quotes was apparently not a top priority for them. A quick disclaimer is obviously in order here. At this point, we don't know for certain if these variations are the result of deliberate interventions by the scribe. Maybe the scribes simply copied exactly what was there in their exemplars. To find the answer, we would have to search for exemplars and other contemporary copies, but that's, of course, outside the scope of this talk. And finally, we can take a look at traces left by readers to see how they perceived and used the Consolation. In the first copy, a 15th century reader added glosses and marginal notes with explanation. On the screen, for instance, you can see how this person added words between the lines to explain certain metaphors. So this person interacted with the text. Now, the interesting thing is that the notes are almost exclusively in Book 1 of the Consolation. And this could be a meaningful clue about the reader's preferences. Book 1 is the most literary and colorful book. You may remember, with the tearful lament and the appearance of philosophy. In my opinion, it's the most amusing and easiest chapter, filled with theatrical drama. So it's quite possible that the notes are only in Book 1 because the reader of our manuscript enjoyed this chapter the most. So the density and location of annotations by readers are a clue for us because they can tell us which chapters or pages were most favored by the readers. And not only the annotations, by the way, but also the level of smudginess or the dirt in books. And I can highly recommend the work by Catherine Rudy at St. Andrews University if you're interested in this type of research. In this manuscript, there are also 15th century marginal notes, but they were almost completely lost when the book block was cut for rebinding. In conclusion, this copy was made for intensive reading and moral instruction for readers who might not understand Greek. And in this copy, there is an emphasis on Christian interpretation by presence of the gloss, the commentary by William of Conches, and from a later date, the reader's notes. The Duinen copy from the beginning of the 13th century was, as I've repeated, heavily marked off for study by a 14th century reader. And this reader also added marginal notes with interpretations of Boethius' text from a Christian point of view. On the slide, for instance, we see a list written by the reader, and the heading says, Cur homo torqueatur, so why man suffers. And then he gives a list of reasons why man suffers, and they all refer to Christian concepts. They refer to Christ, to Mary, etc. When we combine the size of the manuscript, the sloppiness of the execution, the low quality of the parchment, the presence of Greek without translations, and the presence of 10 other philosophical texts, we can conclude that this copy was intended for an educated person and that it was probably made by that same person. The later editions of navigational aids and Christian interpretations in the margins show that this copy was used for profound study and probably also as a resource for ideas and quotes, possibly for the production of sermons. Cistercians had pastoral care towards their own community, and for the constant production of sermons, this book would have been very useful. What's also interesting in this manuscript and the previous one is that they contain marginal notes from the 14th and 15th centuries. Medieval books, especially in monastic communities, as we saw in the previous presentation, could remain in use for centuries, and these two manuscripts are also excellent examples. In Krabbe's copy, there are annotations in the margins in a humanistic cursive, and it's possible that this is Krabbe's hand. Other writings by him in other manuscripts are in a Gothic script, but who knows? In his love for humanism, he might have tried to master a humanistic script. The annotations are quite superficial. They either serve as a heading for paragraphs or as concise explanations, for instance, to explain that the Greek letters pi and theta on philosophy's dress stand for practical and theoretical philosophy. So that's this small annotation here. I believe Jan Krabbe ordered this copy simply for the pleasure of owning and reading Cicero and Boethius in a humanistic script, not for the intention of profound study or exegesis. Krabbe's copy of the Consolation is telling of the growing interest in Bruges for humanism. Although his abbey was in Kokzijde, Krabbe spent a lot of his time in Bruges. And in the 15th century, there was a strong presence of Italians in Bruges, working mostly in finance or in trade. The most famous example are probably Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife, portrayed here by Jan van Eyck. But in his lifetime, Krabbe was personally acquainted with some of the most notorious Italians in Bruges, like Anselm Adornes and Tommaso Portinari, who headed the Bruges Medici Bank. And Bruges was also a hub for the international book trade, and classical and humanist texts were for sale at the Bruges book market from the 1460s onwards. So Krabbe's interest in humanism was certainly progressive, but not exceptional. What is unique is that few such books are known to have been ordered by inhabitants of Bruges or by Flemings outside the Italian colonies in Bruges. So Krabbe's classical and humanist manuscripts are important witnesses to the spread of Italian humanism in Bruges. For further reading on Krabbe and his manuscripts, I can recommend the work by Noël Gernaert. On to Mercatellis' copy. Here there are also some marginal annotations that serve as headings, but there are almost no explanatory glosses or annotations. The only one I have found dates from the 16th century. But in contrast to Krabbe's copy, this manuscript contains a commentary by Pseudo Aquinas, and this commentary dominates the entire volume. So study and interpretation were an important part of this copy. What is very exciting about this manuscript is that it is copied from an incunable, from a printed book, from the 1483 edition by Anton Koberger in Nuremberg. Here they are both open on the first page of Book 1. If you make abstraction of the decoration, you can see some similarities. In 1483, there were other incunable editions of the Consolation available. So why did he or his manuscripts broker choose the Koberger edition? If you want to do research on incunables, you're in luck because there is a fantastic comprehensive database online for incunables, which you can see on the screen. Now, this tells me that there are 21 editions printed before 1484. Of these, 8 contain the Consolation with the commentary by Pseudo Aquinas, making this commentary by far the most popular of the time in printing. So it makes sense that this commentary was chosen. So then we need to ask, why did they use Koberger's edition and not one of the others? And for this, I asked my colleague Ludo van Damme, who is an expert on incunables, for some help. And apparently, Koberger's editions are known for their wide availability because Koberger printed his editions in large numbers. So it's likely that Mercatellis used a Koberger incunable as exemplar simply because it was easily available to him. In conclusion, Mercatellis' manuscript shows us yet another stage of reading culture in Flanders. In terms of content, with its pseudo-Aquinas Christian commentary and its full-page miniatures and marginal decoration, it's very medieval. But in its connection with printed books, it also takes part in the early modern era. Now, one final point on the Krabbe and Mercatellis manuscripts. They are both in Latin, but by the end of the 15th century, there are already 13 translations in French and 3 translations in Dutch. The Burgundian court in Bruges favored the versions in French, and Bruges is the birthplace of 2 Dutch translations. And on top of that, the first edition of a French translation appeared in Bruges, printed by Collard-Mention in 1477. So Krabbe and Mercatellis had easy access to translations. But still, in keeping with their position as abbots, as leaders of the church, they favored Latin for their manuscripts. So these 4 Boethius manuscripts have painted a picture for us of the ever-evolving and transforming reading culture in Flanders. I hope you enjoyed our time together. I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope to welcome you all next week for our session on medieval miniatures and heraldry.